The morning is cold, the kind of cold that gets into a man's bones and stays there even after the coffee, even after the engines start coughing to life. A young pilot, maybe 22, maybe younger, pulls on his leather gloves and looks up at the sky over England. Gray, always gray. He has seen this sky for months now, and every time he climbs into the belly of that big bomber, he wonders if he will see it again. This is the story of those young men, the ones who flew, the ones who came back, the ones who didn't. Imagine the order coming down the line: strike, strike without warning, destroy the enemy air force on the ground before it can ever leave the runway, blast those who manage to escape into the air. It sounds simple when you read it in a planning document. It sounds clean. But up there, at 25,000 feet, with the wind howling past the fuselage and the temperature falling far below freezing, nothing is clean. The bombers came in waves, again and again. The men inside them were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college students from California who had never been further than the next town over until the war pulled them out of their lives and dropped them into the cockpits of the largest air armada the world had ever seen. Their targets were carefully chosen. Railroads first, because without the rails the enemy could not move men or supplies, cut the iron veins, and the armies in the field would starve. Then the harbors, the ships, the factories, anything that fed the war machine had to be broken down piece by piece. But the enemy did not stand still. Down below, in hidden airfields scattered across occupied Europe, fighter pilots were waiting. Their interceptors rose to meet the bombers like wasps defending a nest. There is a moment in every bomber mission that the crews came to dread more than anything else. They called it the long lead. The fighters had finished their work, they had to turn back, their fuel was gone, and the bombers were on their own, still hundreds of miles from the target, exposed. That was when the enemy commander would strike. He would watch from above, picking out the stragglers, the wounded ships limping along on 3 engines or with their formations broken. His fighters would close in for the kill. The bombers did what they could. They flew in tight formations so their combined guns could throw up a wall of lead. They protected each other, but the German fighters were skilled and the anti-aircraft barrage from the ground was relentless. Planes began to show damage, some dropped behind, some never came home. And yet, despite the threat of sudden violent death, those flyers stuck to their jobs. They held formation. They opened their bomb bay doors over the target. They pressed the release. They did what they had been asked to do even when their friends were burning in the sky beside them. Not once did an enemy succeed in making one of those missions turn back before its task was complete. Not once. While the Allied bombers droned over Europe by day, German engineers were working desperately in their hangars. They knew they were losing the air war and they were searching for any technological edge that might buy them time. Out of that desperation came a new silhouette, the Messerschmitt 410 called the Hornet. It was the second attempt at an idea that had failed badly the first time. Its predecessor, the 210, had been so dangerously unstable that pilots feared to fly it. Engineers stretched the fuselage, fitted new and more powerful engines, and tried again. The Hornet was a strange and beautiful machine. It had a heavily glazed canopy where the pilot and a rear gunner sat back to back, giving them a wide field of vision. The gunner controlled something new. A remote-controlled barbette system that let him aim machine guns mounted on the sides of the aircraft without ever leaving his seat or exposing himself to enemy fire. Beneath its nose was a weapons bay that could be configured in many ways. It could carry bombs, or it could mount a massive 50mm cannon capable of tearing an Allied bomber apart from a distance well beyond the reach of defensive guns. It was fast, nearly 400 miles per hour. It was dangerous, and it arrived too late. By the time it entered service in meaningful numbers, the war had already turned. The factories that built it were being bombed flat. The skies above Germany were filled with Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The Hornet was simply outnumbered, outproduced, and overwhelmed. It was a machine of desperate ingenuity, built in the twilight of an empire that knew it was falling. Far from the cold skies over Germany, another group of men were fighting a war that was, in many ways, harder than the one being fought against the Nazis. These were the Tuskegee Airmen. African-American pilots who had to sue their own government just for the right to wear a uniform and fly a plane. By 1944, they were in Italy escorting heavy bombers on missions deep into enemy territory. They flew over Anzio, over the Alps, over Berlin itself. They painted the tails of their P-51 Mustangs red, and they became known among the bomber crews as the Red Tails. Something remarkable happened. The bomber crews, mostly white men from segregated states, began specifically requesting the Red Tails for their escort missions. Why? Because the Red Tails did not abandon them. They did not chase glory or break formation to hunt enemy fighters for personal kill counts. They stayed close to the bombers, they protected them, they brought them home. It was tactical discipline born of necessity. These men knew that if they failed, every door that had been slowly opening for them would slam shut. So they did not fail. They flew with a precision and dedication that earned them respect even from the men who had once doubted them. When the war ended, their record helped force a reckoning at home. The military would never be the same. The civil rights movement that followed would point to the Red Tails as proof of what had been possible all along. Half a world away, the war wore a different face. Here, the enemy was an empire that had spread itself across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. To beat it, Allied air power had to be remade for a new kind of fight. In December of 1943, a place called Cape Gloucester on the western tip of New Britain was about to feel the full weight of what was coming. For 2 weeks before the amphibious landing, B-25 bombers and other aircraft pounded the position relentlessly. Over 1,000 sorties were flown. More than 3,000 tons of bombs were dropped on gun positions, beaches, and bivouac areas. Thousands of rounds of ammunition tore into the jungle below. When the ground troops finally went ashore, they were walking onto an island that had already been worked over for so long that resistance was a fraction of what it might have been. That was the new equation of war. Air power was no longer a supporting role. It was the opening act, the main act, and sometimes the closing act all in one. With Okinawa in Allied hands, everything changed. From there, swarms of bombers could reach the home islands of Japan. The risk had to be taken, and it was. On the island of Okinawa itself, 5,000 miles from San Francisco, the earth shook from a pounding by Allied ships and planes that few places on earth have ever endured. To the south, British allies brought their naval might against the bypassed fortress of Sakishima, paying off old debts to the Pacific War with shell and bomb. England's greatest battleships and newest carriers were there, screening the southern flank. To the north, an admiral named Mark Mitcher led his tireless task force in a relentless aerial assault on the Japanese home islands. It was the 4th of July in reverse, with American planes setting fire to Japanese shipping, harbors, airfields, and factories. Not every man in the sky carried bombs or guns. Some carried cameras. High above the brutal jungles of New Guinea, a unique breed of aviator flew a very different kind of war. Their aircraft was the F-5 Lightning, a variant of the famous P-38 stripped of its heavy armament. No guns, no bombs, just cameras. K-17s and K-18s mounted where firepower used to be. The men who flew them were often top-tier fighter pilots, men who had earned the right to fly the best aircraft and were now reassigned to take pictures instead of shoot down enemy planes. They flew alone without the comforting protection of a squadron formation. They went deep behind enemy lines, into airspace teeming with enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire, and their only defense was their own piloting skill and the speed of their aircraft. The intelligence they brought back dictated the movement of entire armies. Generals planned invasions based on what those photographs revealed. Naval strategists chose targets based on harbor images taken at 20,000 feet by men who knew that one mistake meant they would not be coming home. And what did the rest of the Air Force call them? Photo Joes, a dismissive nickname for men who provided 90% of all Allied air intelligence in the Pacific. They were unarmed, they were alone, and they were heroes who quietly turned the tide of the war without ever firing a shot. Back in America, the Air Forces needed men, hundreds of thousands of them. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, radio operators, mechanics. The recruiting effort had to reach every small town and every big city in the country. So they made a film, and they put a movie star in front of the camera. His name was James Stewart. Every American who went to the pictures knew his face. He had played the gentle everyman in a dozen beloved films, and now, in uniform with a lieutenant's bars on his shoulders, he stood before the camera and spoke directly to the young men of America. He showed them the Flying Fortress, not as a weapon but as a symbol, a giant of the skis that required 10 highly trained specialists working in perfect unison to bring it to life. He told them the old barriers were gone. The Army did not care what college you had attended or what family you came from. It needed courage, aptitude, and a steady hand. Through that film, raw recruits were transformed in the public imagination into the navigators and bombardiers and pilots of tomorrow. Stewart himself was not just acting. He flew combat missions. He commanded a bomber squadron. He came home with the rank of colonel and the respect of every man who served under him. His was the dawn of a new kind of war, where the boy who had sold tickets at the picture house in some small town could end up at 20,000 feet over Germany with his hands on the controls of a four-engined bomber. In the Pacific, A new kind of naval warfare was being written in blood and aviation fuel. Carrier-based planes of the United States Pacific Fleet appeared suddenly overhead at the most critical moment. Dive bombers penetrated the Japanese fighter screen. They pushed through the anti-aircraft fire. And in 5 minutes, two great Japanese carriers, the Akagi and the Soryu, lay broken in the water. 5 minutes, that was how long it took to destroy two of the most powerful warships in the world. The old doctrine of naval warfare that battleships ruled the seas was rewritten in the time it takes to boil an egg. Air power had won. Surface ships, no matter how heavily armored, could not survive in waters where the enemy had control of the sky. The Imperial fleet gathered its remaining pilots for one last effort. Men who had been among the best in the world were ordered to attack the American carriers at all costs with all sacrifice. They flew into a wall of defensive fire. Most did not return. By the closing months of the war, a new aircraft loomed over the Pacific. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. It was so advanced that it rendered every previous bomber obsolete. Sitting on the tarmacs of Guam and Saipan and Tinian, these machines represented the largest engineering gamble in American history. $3 billion had been spent to develop them. They were the first bombers with fully pressurized cabins, allowing their crews to operate at 30,000 feet in shirt-sleeve comfort, free from the bulky flight suits and oxygen masks that had defined the air war over Europe. Their defensive guns were no longer wrestled by hand. Gunners sat in sighting blisters and used analog computers to remotely direct 5 turrets, tracking enemy fighters with mathematical precision. It was the most complex aircraft ever mass-produced. But the bomber was only half the story. To strike the heart of Japan, those giants had to fly 1,500 miles over open water, face the flak and fighters of the mainland, and then make the long flight home. They did not go alone. From the sulphurous rock of Iwo Jima rose their little friends, the North American P-51 Mustangs. These were not the short-range interceptors of the early war. Equipped with drop tanks and the legendary Merlin engine, they flew the longest fighter escort missions ever attempted. 7 hours in a cramped cockpit. A round-trip equivalent to crossing the Atlantic, only to engage in a dog-fight over Tokyo before turning around and doing it all again in reverse. It was a test of endurance unlike any other in the history of aviation, and the men did it again and again, until there were no more targets left worth striking. When the war finally ended, the sky over the Pacific was quiet for the first time in years. The bombers that had not been shot down came home. The carriers that had not been sunk sailed back to American ports. The men who had not been killed walked off those ships and tried to remember what civilian life was supposed to feel like. They had been farm boys, mechanics, clerks, students. They had answered a call that took them halfway around the world, into machines that had not existed when their war began. They had bombed cities and escorted fortresses and photographed harbors and shot down fighters. They had buried friends in cemeteries on 6 continents and at the bottom of every ocean. And when they came home, most of them did not talk about it. They put their uniforms in closets. They went back to the lives they had left. They built businesses and raised families and grew old. But the sky remembers. Every contrail at 30,000 feet, every silver wing catching the sun, every distant rumble of engines passing overhead is a faint echo of what those young men did when the world needed them. This is their story, the story of the men who flew when flying still meant something dangerous and new. The story of an entire generation that climbed into the cold dawn and refused to come back until the job was done. Every aircraft has a story, every pilot has a name, every mission was made of moments that will never be repeated. They deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a history book but as the young men they were, brave, frightened, determined, and very, very far from home. The sky belongs to them now, it always will.